which is specifically about the films, the 4 films that we're screening from the Zanzibar collective, but also we'll be making reference to Jean-Luc Godard's the 2 versions of Sympathy for the Devil, aka 1+1. 1+1 we screen on the opening night of the events, and we'll be screening the producer's cuts later this evening at 7:30. Anyway, on my far right is Richard Tuohy. Sorry, not watching TikTok videos, I'm just going to pull up my notes. So Richard is a filmmaker. He is one of the founders of the founder of Arts of Film.
Sure, with Diana, yes.
With Diana. And also Nana Lab, which he and Diana run. Jack Wilson, sitting next to Richard, is a film critic and curator, and he is the author of the weekly Moving Targets. And Philipa, on my right, Philipa Hawker, writes across the arts and film in particular, and is the former editor of Cinema Papers. Look, it's probably, if you don't mind, just to provide a little bit of broader and I guess political context to May 68. So General de Gaulle led the Free French movement in exile in England during the Second World War, and when he returned triumphant to Paris, amongst the things that he declared was that he would, the country, I should say, the nation would rebuild itself through culture, and in particular through cinema. So, won't go into all of the details about May 68 itself. Safe to say that there was a movement against de Gaulle because he'd become very authoritarian and was making decisions very much by himself. The revolt, put one way, was very much led in the first instance by students, by student unions. They were the first to build the barricades. And then, in very, very simplistic terms, they joined forces with the trade unions. So there were large-scale battles in the streets of Paris with the paramilitary CRS, who were very much regarded as the sort of the strike force, very brutal strike force, like de Gaulle's private army. And de Gaulle left the country clandestinely for a couple of weeks to confer with his military leaders to ensure that they were on side, because they did come very close to actually succeeding. De Gaulle made his way back to the country, called a snap election, and won by a landslide. So the function of this panel is not to go into those details necessarily, nor indeed to judge the events of May 68 as a success or a failure, but one thing that which sits really at the centre, is sort of the pivot upon which this program sits, is that there was this extraordinary sort of cultural and creative movements that sprang up out of May 68. I think it's also important to say that the loose-knit collective that was the Zanzibar group, so it was sort of a half a generation younger than the filmmakers of the Nouvelle Vague, the New Wave. They were returning to zero in their approach to filmmaking. That was a political act for them. They weren't necessarily avowedly political in terms of directly participating, at least to my knowledge, in the events of May 68, but they wanted to, therefore by declaring a return to zero, they wanted to essentially break away all of the conventional, the traditional orthodox hierarchies of film production. So I've got a couple of prompts for us to discuss to begin with. So, as I've said, I mean, the existing film landscape in France at the time was very much about the Nouvelle Vague, and I think this is an opportune moment to bring Jean-Luc Godard into the conversation. He served very much as a creative driver in many respects of the Zanzibar filmmakers, most notably his three previous films before before 1968, before the events of May 1968. I think let's begin with the new wave. If one of you would like to give maybe something of a context to the filmmakers of the new wave, and ultimately, just by way of background, Jake, you're beaming like a Cheshire cat in anticipation.
I was just pondering how one would do that, because there are so many angles you could cover it from and so many different things to say. And I guess the first thing to say is the label new wave can be applied very broadly or very in a more narrow way, and it can mean every young director of roughly the generation born, say in the 30s, roughly, who've got to make a first feature in France in the early 60s, which I believe are about 100, or it can be narrowed further to a group of less than a dozen directors, or it can be narrowed further still to the small group of guys who were critics of cinema, the most influential film magazine of all time, who really reshaped film criticism before they went on to reshape filmmaking. And it's easier to just talk about that group of guys because they did have something in common, whereas if you expand it out, they have all people include the less there is in common. And that small group, Jean-Luc Godard, Tuohy, Eric Romer, Jacques Rivette, Claude Chabrol, they did have in common at least a devotion to cinema as an art form, which was just about watching films, about writing about them, and they had Cinematheque. Maybe you should mention that there was a series of events involving the Paris Cinematheque at the beginning of 68, ousting, temporary ousting of its director on Warlow, and there were protests about this, which was seen by some people as a sort of precursor to the events.
Or at least a sort of clarion call.
Good, because they did reflect what you were talking about, James, is the sort of the idea of trying to tighten up and control culture, because the Cinematheque has been run, chaotically, but with enormous sort of skill and devotion by Alain Langlois, it was a sort of bureaucratizing and control mechanism which failed spectacularly and galvanized people who would never otherwise have been on the same side, because there were demonstrations and letters from around the world. Stanley Kubrick wrote in
for Cinematheque is amazing.
So the Cinematheque, and so it's sort of film screenings and film and writing about film are really pretty central to this group, isn't it? The smaller group that you're talking about, that sort of gathering sort of more, but then the wider group as well, because I think it created an audience and a debate and an excitement, because they made their name, these films, the group we're talking about, as incredibly fierce and wide-ranging critics of contemporary French cinema, but also people who wrote in a really different way about Hollywood cinema, and just sort of tried to and then went on to make films, and that's kind of the exciting thing that we're talking about, really.
So there's a sort of paradox in that when you talk about a return to zero and you think about the new wave, there's two sides to it. One is that the new wave were inspirational to filmmakers in many countries, including here in Australia, as people who did in a way start from zero, who broke some of the rules about what it was to make good film, and they worked on low budgets, they shot on location, sometimes they shot on 16mm. They were within the film industry, but they were in other ways sort of showing that you could be a sort of amateur and still make a film. So that's one side of sort of returning to zero. On the other hand, there were people who were to a much greater degree than previous generations of filmmakers had been immersed in film history, sort of going right back to the silent era. They felt themselves to be part of film history.
And therefore a continuity.
Yeah. But they made up a particular history. It's the idea of choosing your precursors. So there were people who they looked to in previous generations, and then they looked to a lot of French cinema certainly, and said, this is as Truffaut said, the tradition of quality, this is what we're against. So it was very much about positioning yourself in the history.
Which is quite different from starting from scratch, which is much closer to the spirit of these Zanzibar people.
Yes and no, I would say. But,
Well, Return to Zero, I think it's a phrase that comes up in Gay Sunlight, which was made before 68, but appeared after and seemed quite involved with. I mean, it's quite an illuminating thing those pages before. But yeah, it's sort of. I mean, because so much changed between 1960 59, 60, when Truffaut and Godard made this enormous sort of impact in incredibly different ways too. I mean, 400 Blows and Breathless are very different films. But then, I mean, all those filmmakers that you talk about, they have such different trajectories. And that's an extraordinary thing too, to see what they did between, let's say, 59, 60 and 68.
I also think that there are a lot of currents that you can see flowing into the Zanzibar films, when you look at them now, that are really not to do with the new wave, or not directly to do with the new wave. And especially, I was looking at, some of you would have just seen the Revolt, right? I wasn't here, but that's great. But when I look at that film, to me it's part of a very serious attempt, not restricted to Gorel, but you can point to other people from the 50s on, to revive the tradition of silent cinema. And I mean, nearly the tradition.
For those that haven't seen it, has no dialogue, is a silent film.
It's a silent film. And it's, in a sense, I mean, not in a sense, like literally a silent film in the tradition
There is no sound.
of D.W. Griffith and Murnau. And if you think, those of you who might have seen Sunrise, one of the most famous silent films by F.W. Murnau, made in Hollywood, one of the things about that film is the characters have no names, and it's like the man, the woman, and they're very particular figures, like they're played by very distinctive performers, but they're also archetypes. And this is true of quite a lot of silent film, that the sort of the effect of it comes from the characters being, caught on, like people caught in film at a certain moment, and at the same time, kind of archetypal standing for, the man, the woman, the young man, the young woman, the child, and so on. And this is the feeling I get from the Revolt that these are.
Well, like Garrel,
Yeah.
Garrel's man, woman, child,
Yeah.
sort of trio that runs sort of his films in an extraordinary way.
Yeah, and there's something extraordinarily, in one sense, conservative about this.
Yeah, and this is a young man at 20 doing this.
So you watched the new screen the Gallows, Richard?
Yes.
Was it the first time you'd seen it?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah. What did you make of it?
Look, I feel.
I'm sorry if we're talking about a film that you haven't seen, but you have just seen.
Sure. Look, I feel that there's a lot of beauty in it. I mean, I enjoyed looking at it. Right, I enjoyed the black and white photography and the relationships between the three figures, and it felt unformed compared to a film like Sunrise. It's radically different.
It is radically different, but I mean, it's also, I'm not saying they're the same, except there are shots like when they're going down the road together, you remember, or in the fields, where to me it is very close. I mean, it's like they're out, like it's Sunrise in the studio. But...
Well, I mean, to me, watching that film, you have to make quite a few leaps to work out, like, why are we seeing this?
Story, yes.
Well, that's
And where did you land in terms of the story?
I was somewhat indifferent. It didn't. I felt that the mode was so kind of primitive that I was happy to just pull back and say, I don't mind. Obviously, this 20-year-old, I'm going to be judgmental there, has thought some things through as to why this particular trajectory, right? But they weren't going to be particularly profound. So it's tough. So, I'd like to be challenged on that because I feel reasonably strongly about it. But I do feel that what I found enjoyable was the freedom, the use of the camera in the field, the kind of sense of play, which was, in all of these small films, this kind of student-like naivety with regards to the use of the camera.
I mean, I feel to that, I should say that X-Men's a masterpiece. Like, it's a great film. And is like way above, I would say, any of the other films in this program. And then if we talk about the Zanzibar films, I mean, we can talk about these people as a group, but we can also talk about Philipa, who is the one person who kept on making films and...
Well, Jackie
Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, but he's kept on that until today.
Did she make films or just...
She did. She made
very good ones.
She was a good one. I mean, I know what you mean, but I like the one there.
Well, this is a very important point, just to, again, to sort of provide a bit of context. So the Zanzibar group came together, again, to mark a distinction which is important between, say, those six, the gang, the tribe of six new wave filmmakers. I mean, it should be added to, I'm sorry, I don't want to jump around too much, but Jake was talking about Henri Langlois, the remarkable founder of the French Cinematheque, kicked out, then reinstated, and then of course the Cannes Film Festival, for example, that year was the site of great protest, and that was largely about precisely what Jake mentioned earlier, which is that French filmmakers, most particularly the New Wave filmmakers, felt that the festival had become, and indeed still is today, deeply conventional and very much a tool of government. I'm not saying they don't run propaganda films.
But also at the time when everything was going on, the festival was an inappropriate thing.
Completely.
So
they
whatever aesthetic arguments they might have.
Yes. So the protesters did, they went through all of the cinemas and stopped the screenings, and so the New Wave filmmakers were very present, very active at the front lines, the barricades there, and then out of that emerged the new section, which is a sort of sidebar section, not formally connected, and again still exists today, the Director's Fortnight, la quinzaine des réalisateurs. But to go back to Langlois was a great champion of the Zanzibar filmmakers. And they only existed really, and again, because it was an informal group, they really only made films over an 18-month period. The films were made very quickly, the films were financed independently by wealthy hippie heiress who asked no questions and indeed sought to have no mention of her name anywhere, because of course most of the films don't actually contain any credits whatsoever. So the other thing to make this distinction with the directors of the New Wave, as Jake very sort of ably demonstrated, they emerged from critical thinking, intellectual thinking, quite politicized in terms of that theoretical approach. The Zanzibar filmmakers largely, I mean, for example, was not directly involved in, at least as I understood, involved in the May 68 protests at all.
He photographed them.
Sorry?
He did photograph, he shot them,
Yes.
But he was there.
Yes, he was certainly very present in that regard, but I mean, one of the reasons, at least as I've understood it too, about him making, because the Révélateur was shot, I think, just outside of Munich in the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest, and I've always thought that one of the reasons why, just to return to that film for a moment, why it is silent is because of Gale's, the reason he chose to shot it outside of France was because, in a sense, he was refuting the disappointments of May 68, well, not refuting, but he had a sense that it was going to be unsuccessful. And that, I don't think he stated this quite so obviously, that one of the reasons why the film is silent is because he was sick of the clown, he was sick of the maelstrom, and that he didn't want there to be any sound in the film, so it should exist as a piece outside of May 68 and all that tumult, even though the film is deeply disturbing and is about specific tumult, and the film is about fleeing. Anyway.
Well, they are visibly fleeing. What they're fleeing from is a little left the imagination.
Yes.
There. I want to say two things quickly, if I can respond to that. One is it's useful, I think it's useful to say that the Cayugos, like the other flank of the French New Wave, the so-called left bank group, in the period when they really were a group, were not that political, and to the degree they were political, might have leaned to the right more than not. Certainly, Eric Vermette was one of the intellectual leaders of this group, he was and remained a conservative. Goddard, on the other hand, was radicalised, but he wasn't that political up to
he's the one that he's the most conspicuous one.
Yes.
Yeah.
The other thing that just came to mind when you're talking about it being silent for reasons to do with like wanting to get away from all the noise at May 68, when I was talking before about how there was a bid to revive silent cinema, I was, I guess, thinking of a context that is not just France, probably primarily not France, which has a lot to do with American underground cinema, and particularly, this might go back to some of what you were saying in the Revolt, Andy Warhol, who...
Because there was at least one, a couple of them was very aware of Warhol's work, and Garel was certainly yes.
Well, I think there was the group regarded had perhaps more of an affinity with that New York downtown underground scene, most particularly Warhol's The Factory, and indeed Jackie Benali, who, of the 4 films that we're screening from the Zanzibar group, there's the first film that she directed, but she was an editor, so she'd worked with Wamea, amongst others, and continued to work with them as an editor before she moved to the United States in, I think it was 72, and became essentially a curator. So she, again, an important point to make is that, as is largely the case still today, there are many, many women editors, because certainly then, and probably to a degree now, as France and central politics remains kind of immovable, that the role of an editor in the filmmaking process was regarded, I guess, the equivalent of being a seamstress. So it was really not something that was... Yes, or a midwife, indeed. So it was really not regarded creatively, well, not creatively, of course it was, but within the hierarchy, it was not regarded as something of huge import to that process. So when the wealthy heiress said to Jackie Honal, stop editing and make your own, direct your first film, within which she places herself in, this incredible scene where she's, I guess, fiddling with the range of different cameras that are placed on the table in front of her. Anyway, so I'm digressing on Jackie Grenal, but I just would like to read something from this very short booklet, I suppose, called The Zanzibar Films and the Dandies of May 68. So the author, who I'll get back to in a moment, she did an interview with excuse me, the wealthy heiress who financed all of the Zanzibar films. She interviewed her in 1999, and this is a quote from the producer. With regard to the Zanzibar films as a whole, whose contents were not political, I think that it is important to state that this is in thanks in parts to the spirit of May that these films were able to come into existence. There was an idea of conquering freedom for many of us, of leaving behind what Guy Debord had memorably called the society of the spectacle, and of participating in several areas at once, without, however, being a professional in any one. We were in sync with the cultural movement in the US in the 1960s and the 1970s, as well as the Chinese Cultural Revolution, or at least how it was perceived in the West at the time. We also sought to put into practice a collective management to reject a delegation of authority. We dared to think of making films without being professionals, by using reduced crews, and often made up of friends as technicians. So I think that really sort of neatly describes that return to zero. Because one of the things that I want to put to the three of you is that, I mean, as we know that remarkably, very brief period of time, around 12 to 14 films were made by the collective, the Zanzibar collective. That lasted about a year and a half. And I think, as Jake or Philipa said, that most of the members of the group, which is why they're called the Dandies of May 68, they actually didn't come from any kind of theoretical background or criticism. They came, or even filmmaking for that matter, they came very much from the worlds of fashion, of photography. So that again marks them as obviously quite distinct from the filmmakers of the new wave.
Well, both groups were empowered.
Yes, yeah.
And there is some new wave actors end up in the Zanzibar.
Well, there are those intersections. I mean, for example, in the Revolateur, there's Bernadette Lafont, who had been in a number of new wave films and would have an extraordinary career in acting generally, but certainly was one of the most prominent of those actors, as was
Leo was even in
Jean-Pierre Léaud and Juliette Berthoud.
Yes.
Also, very much a figure for Godard in those three seminal films that he made prior to May '68. There are cameramen, there are others that did intersect. But I don't know that there was a sort of any more of a cross-fertilisation of that. But what I did want to say was, which is important for us to remember and reflect on and discuss, is that apart from some of those films screening at the reinstated Cannes Film Festival, selected by Henri Langlois, the head of the French Cinematheque, and in fact a couple of the films, the only title card of the Zanzibar films is La Cinémathèque Française Présente, just to show the level of support from Langlois in particular. So what is of course intriguing, and I'm taking way too long getting around to making this point, but the films were lost. The group did essentially, a number of them went down to North Africa. Serge Bard, whose film we're screening at 5:30, his first film we screened yesterday, he actually converted to Islam and all but renounced filmmaking. Jackie Renal, who naturally need to keep referring to, as I said, she went to New York, where she lived for a number of years, working principally as a curator to the Angelica and other, hugely significant sites of independent filmmaking, curatorial practice. Does anyone have a sense of why the group effectively all went to, I don't mean as a group, but the work, of which there are again sort of a dozen, 14 films or so, why it was that they have disappeared from view, or just is it because they were, it was so much that the filmmakers of the New Wave, and most particularly because of their involvement with Cahiers du Cinéma was less interested in the...
They were interested in Garel.
Yes, they were interested in Garel, but not so much the others. Their support for...
No, September '68, they had a great big, 10-page interview with him.
Yes, yeah.
Really, the question is, why didn't they receive critical acclaim? Because they'll never receive anything else, because they're too primitive. Like, it's natural that such a film is too difficult for a general audience to appreciate.
Yeah, they didn't get the impression. I mean, they had a catalogue, didn't they? I mean, there was, in some ways, they were
made for
quite well.
a selection of films presented in the United States.
But there was this sort of seeming determination to get the films out there to whatever audience they hoped to find. But and the Garel films, do you know anything more about this, Jacob?
No, all I do is speculate, yeah. I mean, I think of how, and this mother who's not been, I think, mentioned, who's the only female director who's commonly associated with the New Wave. I mean, she wound up in Hollywood with her husband, Chuck and they were both making Hollywood films of sorts. But the reason I mentioned that is it was this moment among a lot of people who were vaguely kind of innovative, associated also with underground filmmaking in America, like Warlow included, that the old ways of filmmaking were just completely on their way out, and narrative was probably on its way out. Everything was going to totally change. This is the kind of thing in a way that was powering so much of the collective dream that was there, not just Paris, but in whatever it is that we call 60s, the counterculture kind of dream. And it didn't happen, not in the way that people imagined it would happen. Certain things happened, many things changed. There were reforms of all kinds of society were never the same, but the dream of transformation just did not occur.
At least a complete transformation, only incremental transformation.
But these films, these like Zanzibar films, they're all being made actually in the wake of something that didn't occur. Gorilla and Jackie Renau, they all kind of flee, and Goddard's over in London doing his thing. It's already kind of there. The failure is kind of inscribed.
Remember the thing that did happen in '68, everyone, that people did kind of flee, like well, Pierre Clemente, who's a really interesting figure in this too, because I mean, an actor, not of the new wave, but made some incredibly interesting films, but was also a very innovative filmmaker in his own right, and an experimental filmmaker. And he was shooting in Rome, and he came back, to be in Paris in '68, and then, but God, when they went Italy, they are. I mean, there was this feeling that things were falling apart.
Jackie Renaud's film was Tuohy was shot in Barcelona.
Yeah.
Does this account for, is this an answer to your question of why these films aren't, widely known or didn't have a continued?
Are there rights issues with them?
I wouldn't have thought so, no. Well, I say that, but I don't know. I'm not sure that you're entirely right about the distribution. I'm not sure about the desire on the part of the group, and I guess most particularly the producers, to find a release.
Well, no,
I mean, there was a small selection, as you say. I mean, there was a catalogue of sorts that was put together. I think it was called something like French Films.
Didn't that areas try and buy a cinema to show these films in? Because they
it's very significant.
the woman who funded
Yes,
them,
it was on us.
did she not buy a cinema?
She tried to.
Yes.
The story was that she couldn't find anybody who wanted to actually run the cinema.
Right. I mean, normally such a film doesn't have a life in a cinema. I'm thinking, for example, of a film that is remembered in the canon, and that would be Wavelength from Michael Snow, which came out just a year before, like '67 or something like that. That film has continued to find an audience, but it's a boutique audience, and never, ever in a cinema. So it was to hire a cinema, to buy a cinema, was kind of like wrong-headed. That's not the kind of life they could possibly have.
I don't have something like that. You mentioned that the society perspective situation is. I mean, the idea of expanded cinema, which started off in the '50s and various. I mean, there are some films within the canon of within Zanzibar that would qualify for that notion. And there's also quite an interesting filmmaker that I'm a bit obsessed with that. An interesting cultural figure, a guy called Marco, who was more of he was part of that group with Fitzroy and talked about expanded cinema in the '50s, but then went into theatre. And he worked with, he who made, I don't think you know, she would have been an actress without Marco kind of working with her. But yeah, I mean, he was another person who had a film coming out in '68, but he fled. He went with God.
De Boer, who was a very radical figure in various ways. He did have a patron who did the buying cinema thing, and yet, there was a cinema in Paris. I think it was in the late '70s that showed nothing but Guy Debord's films. And backed by this supporter of his, whose name I forget. So it was possible. Like he just needed to have money to throw around. And how many people ever went to that cinema? I have no idea, but I'm sure some did.
The money aspect of all this is also quite interesting. I mean, this is a very peculiar relationship that this group had with a millionaire who presumably found them. Or did she cause the formation of the them?
I can't, in terms of those circumstances to how they encountered each other, I think they were parts of, some of the members of what became the Zanzibar Collective, knew each other, worked, there was a sort of a circle that included, other art critics most particularly, and artists, painters, who either featured in the films or were involved creatively. And again, the films were made very, very quickly. Almost all of them shot on 35.
That's the weird. That's the weird thing.
Yes.
That is something that puts them in the fossil record, rather than having them disappear like so many half-inch tape or Super 8 films. Like, seriously?
Yeah.
Especially, I can't remember which of the films. So there's one of them that really made me think, this should have been shot on a quarterback as a theatre workshop, and then possibly recorded over next year. Because that's what happened. Not because it needed it or whatever, but that would be the normal course of events. But for it to be on 35 and to be kind of rediscoverable and to be, it has a dignity that is kind of incongruous. I don't want to say it's misplaced, except what's misplaced is the fact that just the justice thing, because like these 6 people or however many they were happened to have this incredible fortune of having a wealthy benefactor throw what is not an inconsiderable sum of money at them just to play.
And part of the story is she did place an ad, I forget in which paper or whatever, saying she'd give money to people for
People would come to her in a cafe and pitch to her.
And she selected them basically on their looks. No, that's where the Danny thing came in. She liked the person who was good looking and well dressed. This was really what made all the difference.
I should add also that she was 24, 25 at the time. Wow.
And also, after she finished with Zanzibar, she went on to run the feminist projects almost exclusively too. There was one of the Zanzibar people, Caroline Bender,
Yes.
who was she was demonstrating in May '68. But I mean, she's an interesting figure because she's English. She's a descendant of Oscar Wilde's lover, Bosie, and she was photographed in May carrying a Vietnamese flag, which she said someone thrust in her. It was a demonstration, and she apparently was disinherited because of that famous photograph.
Well, she also became known as the Marianne.
May 68,
She was very striking.
Yeah, but I mean, and she went on to be a filmmaker. She made films too. I mean, I think there were and just as Jackie Manal made a film in New York, Hotel New York, which is quite film actually. But yeah, I mean, style was definitely, it's something that Sally Sharpe in her book emphasises a lot, but it's definitely a feature of this group is style.
I would like to emphasise that, and I should have said it to begin, that if at any time you'd like to ask a question or offer some kind of commentary, please don't hesitate and speak quite loudly because we're not great.
Was the Marianne of 68, was she the actress in the first Serge Bard film?
Yes, that's right.
That's right. She was in a couple, I mean, she was a bit of a news.
Yes, so she's in.
She had definitely seen herself back on, like she'd been filmed, staring at the camera, seen it back and thought, this is the thing. Because it is.
Well, that reminded me of very much of a Warhol screen test. That felt very Warholian, that image, yes.
Something we've not talked about is what these films have to do with drugs, which is a lot, I think.
Or what drugs have to do with the films.
Well, both, right? Like, I mean, these are films.
Please,
well, I mean, I feel like I'm not going to necessarily speculate on which drugs people were on while in the films or making them, but I think that the whole climate of what they are, and especially something like the Revolt, it's about, there's sort of two sides to the, like what I was talking about is the 60s. One is this sort of collective thing about creating a new kind of society, and the other is really to do with drugs, which tend by and large to send people off, as they said in the day, on their own trips. Where you're not going off into your own head, and there's a lot of going off into your own head in these Zanzibar films, and you can really feel it in the Revolt. And I don't think he made another film which I got to see lately, the concentration where they were tripping.
I'm not sure who the actors were, but the one, Zuzu was one of the actors, said that the crew, everyone else was. And they were locked together for 3.5 days making this film. But drugs are certainly a part of that milieu in certain ways. They still need to be, I guess, a working about it.
Sorry, you go. There's some two sides to these movies in another way, which is sort of to do with something that you were say, on the one hand, there's a kind of idea of burying the device, kind of exposing kind of what, you know, this poor cinema idea, which is to do with the situationists, and also kind of connects to the structural material kind of phenomenon that happened a bit later in American cinema around the same time with people like Michael Stone, where it's kind of, you know, disillusioning, showing what cinema really is. You get bits of that in Tuohy, where she says, we're going to be witness to the end of meetings tonight and so on. And then there's the opposite, which is more like what you have in Warhol's films, which is the trance element, where you can zone out, you're invited to zone out in front of the film, get out of your usual frame of mind and just kind of be in this space which is more or less hallucinatory. And that's definitely what Revolt is. I feel is what it's doing, basically.
Can I just interject that I reckon, given the amount of money involved and they were from quite wealthy families, probably a heroine with acting playing a part here, and that would explain the very slow and attention to detail. Really, probably smack chic we're going off here.
Simon is actually an undercover policeman.
Yes, and yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, very deep. Thanks, I didn't actually realise that, but you're probably right. We've all got our narc inside, haven't we? And Jake, it was Gerard Libovici, Studio Cujas on Rue Cujas, just outside the Sorbonne, was the theatre you were thinking of. It was shot in a car park. Respect. Yeah.
I'm just on the heroin thing. I mean, apart from like the makers of these films, I mean, I think it's fair to assume that quite a large percentage of the audience when these films were first shot were probably stoned. I mean, it seems like this was the kind of
Not all of them would have been on smack. Only some of them who had a predilection for it. But generally, you can tell from the way a film is shot what the people were tripping on if you're an aficionado of 60s and 70s cinema.
So it's interesting if you say that at the time the audience would have been very different from an intellectual audience.
The viewers wouldn't have been on smack. They would have been probably most of the viewers would have been too poor to afford. It only became cheap in the 80s after Thatcher.
Yeah, I mean, intellectuals, like, I mean, it's not mutually exclusive from...
That's not mutually exclusive, however, one tends to include the other when it's happening.
Yes, that seems fair. I mean, or at least it tends to change what, you know, the nature of the intellectual process looks like.
Yeah, right.
I wanted to ask about, so talking about the regulators, like the return to silent film and that kind of, you know, trend in this group, where you replace filmmaker who's a little bit older, but I think also very radical, is Marcel Levin. So his first film, A Simple Story, in 1959, I think, is like that uses a lot of like silent cinema language, and then, yeah, I don't know, like, do you think there's any link between him and this kind of movement?
I don't know his films well. Do you know much, Philipa?
No.
No, you can probably speak.
What do you think?
Well, I don't think I'm like well acquainted enough with his Zanzibar group to speak authoritatively, but like, but yeah, he's a very interesting director because you know his films were never sort of like embraced by the mainstream, even though like critical mainstream in France, and I think I sort of see him as like a lot of kind of underground cinemas, you know, because when we ask the question like why a film or why a film hasn't received the critical attention it deserves, it's kind of a circular question because like the fact we're talking about it now, and that there are some sort of like places where these works are still promoted, like Revolt, which is really important French kind of DVD distribution label.
It's where the Zanzibar film will come from.
Yeah, and they've released a lot of films on DVD, the only place where you can get them. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. It'd be fascinating to go further.
But do you think what you were saying he might have a relation to silent cinema in particular?
Well,
the silent kind of cinema.
Well, so like Revolt is silent film.
Yeah.
And as you said, that maybe contains links to like No Sunrise. Simple Story is which I recommend anyone to check out. It's a sound film, but like it's very very sparse in the way sound is used, and it's very much focused on the faces of its Ubumangu, because in a way it's very reminiscent from
I don't buy that at all, I'm afraid, the thing about silent cinema, because silent cinema wasn't silent. Most of the old silent films, of course, had musical accompaniments that were quite elaborate, and the only films that were actually projected silent, to my knowledge, were either the Warhol films or American Underground Theatre or pornographic films.
But I may be wrong about this, but I believe that when those films were screened at the Cinematheque, they were shown silent. So this will be
Well, yeah, okay, good on you, Jake. I'll get my coat.
There'll be another experience what the filmmaker necessarily intended. And Sunrise, literally speaking, I should also say, is not a silent film. It's a film without dialogue, but it does have.
Yeah, that's right.
But there's something else. The other figure, just as you were talking, David, that came to mind, who I think is very connected with Durrell, is Ingmar Bergman. And Bergman was he's not making silent films, but he's making psychodramas. He's making films which they're very sparse, again, they're about really what's going on inside somebody's head. They're black and white, they have this same sort of intensity, and you can connect that also to Simon Watt, even like the very early Stan Brakhage films, what some other people were doing in America. So I think there are quite a few currents that are in a way about bringing back a very, you said, primitive version of cinema, which start in the 50s, maybe even like going back to Idera in the 40s.
You might also link it to what's going on with the Cinematheque and the resurrection of these films, because
Yeah.
they were sort of lost and then refound.
Yeah.
When Bergman is totally investing in that kind of history of Swedish silence and Street Films, of course, Peas and Wild Strawberries, and that kind of silent aesthetic. So, I mean, I think what you were talking about, David, I mean, I think there is, even a film like Rivers of Eden is very much engaged with.
Well, that was what I was thinking.
The history of silent cinema and the aesthetics of silent cinema.
Andrea came to Paris, and I think Anna Karina was his interpreter.
Oh,
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah.
Which would make sense because
It just seems a reasonably long bow, apart from the development. The development, apart from that film, to emphasise a discussion on silent cinema with relation to Zanzibar films. I put it to you.
I think that the thing that, apart from that film, which is silent, and I'm trying to think which other one, there was silent portions.
Yes,
that's
the Shakira.
That's not all silent, but it's playing a lot of sound, and what the idea of, we can get sound or not.
Yeah, so well.
So there's this kind of, immediately the question of, relation between sound and image is kind of a problem with these films. How does it work? But beyond that, I think what I'm getting at is really that these early silent movies, they're made by people, a generation for whom cinema was embedded in their lifetime. And it's, that in itself is kind of miraculous. When I watch these films still, it's something that I feel that these people making these films are a little astonished that this is possible, that you can capture something and it's there, potentially forever, that, it's a magic trick. And that magic trick, that idea of just pointing the camera at something and immediately it becomes both a documentary record and another world, like it goes to black and white, it's no longer sort of, just the person that you met yesterday, you were kind of casting a spell, that feeling of casting a spell on reality.
Right, and that speaks very much of the kind of pre-1910 cinema. I don't know the dates personally, but you know what I mean. But by about 1910, surely silent cinema is synonymous with narrative film.
Well, I think that there was a certain trend, critical trend that absolutely embraced silence and magazines like Close-Up, I think things like that, this notion that silent cinema is an absolutely ultimate art form, that introducing dialogue will in fact destroy the art.
I often argue this.
So story, there is that implication. And I think that...
Yeah, I'm just bringing it back to Zanzibar.
Yeah, but they're not.
Because they're anti-narrative by and large.
Yeah, in some degree.
James' point, the Libera the Turk, you said there's sort of a story there, they're playing with, abstract's not the story, every ask you get questions and it falls apart. There is a story, but when you said that about the films pre-1910, the guy who is sort of commonly thought to have kind of changed things is D.W. Revolt, who's invented some grab up of narrative film, kind of refined it. But when like in the 1940s, when he had got to make film for a decade or so, and talking pictures were the thing, he said, I think I get this right, that what he missed about cinema now was wind in the trees. And you know, out there shooting on that location. And the wind in the trees is not the story. So he was never just about the story.
That's just before you move on, I'm just going to let that sit in my ears.
Ian, I should point out, is one of my part of the team. He owns the posters here. There's part of his collection, and also the book on the music scene between 68 and 78. Sorry, Ian.
Yes. Having my question has nothing to do with any of those things.
No.
Philipa, you said something that my ears wouldn't pick up. Marco and Fitzroy Zoo. And like the lectures were the best self-promoters, but I have no idea how widespread they were as an influence within French cinema. But yesterday I noticed I was talking to James in the Renault film. There seem to be references to Gilles Gould's anti-concept and to Izu's use of film stock, just beginning stuff. Were the lectures actually of influence at all within film?
To some degree, I think. I mean, I feel like I'm not the best person to answer it, but I feel as if there were definitely influences, but in a mix. Margot moved on and went to theatre and kind of cut his ties a bit with Izu. Obviously, Du Bois, influential.
His films were very influenced by Izu.
Yes, oh, very much so. And I mean, there's real sort of debates about, like, Du Bois is regarded by some people as a real kind of, as having kind of taken a great deal from, in an uncredited, without crediting. But look, I think that's a question I always have to take on notice. But I think it's one of those things that there are so many different groups and artists, and there are lots of interesting filmmakers outside the new wave categories, or you talk about the Left Bank and Agnes Varda. I mean, there are so many filmmakers in making films sort of together and separately in that period in France in the 50s onwards, that it's sort of just keeping tabs on them all is extraordinarily difficult, and some of them are very much in a sort of radical or experimental tradition, and some of them go in very different direction.
James, you have any question?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the Revolt, but I was just a bit surprised at the choice of label with the word primitive, because for me, films so essential in how sparse the elements of labour, the mother, father, child, shadow, light, and just the sound of my own breath. And it kind of demanded a very physical experience from me. One of the very powerful movie.
Primitive isn't a negative term. Essential is almost the same term.
Yeah. I guess I don't misconstrue the connotations of the word primitive then. But I guess I was just curious as to well, yeah, I guess that's not my question.
Amanda?
Oh, yeah. It's very good to ask you, Jane, because Philip Rosie did a score for the Revolt.
Yes.
Did you? Because he was here yesterday, wasn't he?
He was launching with launching it.
Right, yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, I wonder if he talked about doing the music for that? Or was that? I mean, I remember it, I saw it when it was at the film festival, but it was an interesting thing to do.
No, but it's alright, we make reference.
What's that?
Well, I mean, when he did it, I was thinking, is this the right thing to do?
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, but it's a good question.
question.
Yeah, as to whether, I mean, it's very debatable. I mean, it was all probably would have been down two screenings, one with and one without.
I have seen it on video, like the year before. It came back to me after we were discussing this, and I didn't go and because I did not want to see it with music, having seen it song.
Right, yeah.
Well, why not add a score to Screams for the Board then? Screams for the Sard. I mean, wouldn't that be better with the score added to it? Or wouldn't that defeat the entire point of the whole film? I mean, I disapprove entirely of adding scores to films that aren't intended to have them, or whether they're intended to have a different one. I think it's obscene that people do new scores, make up their own shit for films that already have like scores perfectly adequately done for them. I think it's tremendous arrogance. Fuck those guys.
I think if the film is made to be shown silent, as you said, most silent films in the silent film era were not. But if the film is made to be shown silent, I think it's probably a mistake to show it with a score.
Yes, that's right.
And
Thanks,
sound
Tom.
is such a manipulator of image. And I think there was obviously a clear choice to present an honest image, or as honest an image as possible, perhaps. So to incorporate.
I think it would completely devalue those Zanzibar films to add music to them. Because I was really getting off on the sound of the toilet flushing and the wind from outside, not the wind from the toilet, and all the other noises that were coming in, people coming in through the door and the glasses chinking, people getting bored and, coughing. It was great. It was. I just wish people had started like fist fights and that.
Well, we look forward to that next screening. We've got time for one brief last question.
I've got a tiny factoid, which is, sorry for me to mention music, you picked up again. Clemente and California, both in a band. It was part of the
I bet Warlow's film is all. Do you know it? It's called The Idols.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's,
Fantastic.
Some of the musicians that are in the old run played on the glow sticks.
That's right, yeah, because that's a fascinating film. Sorry.
I've got a really quick question. The images evoke emotions. So what's your view on, the influence of that? I wrote down some of the feelings. Bleak, despair, hopeless, menacing, an undercurrent of violence. Does anybody else feel like this?
Simon's getting excited.
Heroin will do that, Sharon. Yeah.
Menace.
You're talking about the
Revolt.
Yeah, but the other two films beforehand, bleak, despairing. In a revolution, shouldn't we feel optimistic about changing the world? Just some thoughts?
Yes and no.
What was influencing?
I agree with, and that's a notion that I'd love to dive into, and I absolutely did with that too. I agree with Jake. I think the film is. I don't like using the word masterpiece, but I think it's an extraordinary piece of cinema.
That's fantastic. Just wondering.
I can see where you're coming from with regards to that response and the emotional situation in many of the films. I mean, I think that when that young woman is looking at the camera like this, like a puppy dog, or it happens also in that. Can you tell me the name of that film?
Is that Tuohy or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then in Jackie's film.
Yes.
Yep. Similarly, there's the boy looking in the camera and trying to make himself cry. He can't do it, but he's trying. Definitely they put this stuff in there, in a kind of, well, now I'm going to say something cynical, so I'll hold back. But I totally agree. Even in Isia Manon, right? There's a heaviness there the whole time.
Is the purpose to push us into action? Is there a purpose behind creating these feelings?
Personally, I'll be cynical and say it's to create an air of seriousness.
I think that, what I said before, most of the films were made not in the moment, or not completed in this moment of May 68. They are films from the aftermath of May 68 and something that didn't work out. But also, Tuohy, I don't think is a despairing film. It's maybe an angry film.
Are you saying, was that something else?
No, I think
Is the Manon?
Tuohy, sorry, that's what it
last
was.
night.
Right, that was
But also, it's like playful at certain points. It has a lot of different sort of emotion going through.
The opening is hilarious.
Yeah, it's funny.
Yes, the opening in particular. Yeah, it's hilarious. This is the one where she's
Eating.
yeah. And then the stuff with the camera, you don't feel that, and the mirrors and stuff. It's later, it's in the second half of that film, I think, that it goes into a generally morose. I mean, there's the couple, huddled in a corner somewhere.
There's been a lot of thinking about revolution prior to this. Yeah, Goddard has been thinking about revolution for some time already. I know what you mean about, I think that's a really interesting point about, being positive or, is there a place for a kind of idea of optimism in films about revolution? I think it's a really interesting point. I'm not sure where it fits with these, but I think it's a really interesting point to consider.
The film is literally about revolution, apart from the fleeing film. I'm terrible with the names.
The Revolt.
No.
The Revolt has fleeing in it.
Yeah, not that one.
Okay.
The one where the woman is spouting stuff that other people
Tuohy
about revolution.
Is the first one, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And she's been criticised by a number of other men, and she's walking along the street with a wall next to her, talking to another girlfriend, saying, "How are we meant to do this?" or whatever. There's a kind of unpleasant, sort of sourness in her milieu. There's this violence too. With this man who presumably is the professor that we see at the end.
We're saying the same thing.
Yeah, no, at the end, yes.
But delivering the manifesto as a lecture.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is kind of like, which is a little bit, the point about it not being political.
Yeah.
Said Barber is political. Naive.
But he's not young.
Yes, but it's sort of odd to say that they were.
But those films are hard to be like period pieces in a way. They can't be separated from that moment.
Destroy Yourselves was made just prior to
Staples,
that's the final part. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. In order to respect our schedule, and particularly the screening of Serge Barnes' film is here. Now, could you please thank Philipa Hawker? The Artist Film Workshop has been extraordinarily supportive of this inaugural event, so thank you to Richard and your comrades at the AFW. Thanks again. Okay.